Good afternoon. My name is Dustin Dupas, Chief Operating Officer at Tabs Analytics. Welcome to our webinar on fact-based selling. This is the first webinar in our 2017 series, and we'll be looking at fact-based selling through the broader process we call FORCE: fact-based, objective, reliable, credible, and easy. We'll dive into the details of this process with some hands-on demonstrations. We also have a few upcoming webinars in March and April: our first annual personal care products industry survey and our second annual baby care survey. Our personal care study webinar will be on March 15th and will be covering key segments such as hair care, personal wash, deodorant, and skin care. Our baby care study webinar will be April 19th and will reprise our popular 2016 study. Be sure and check back at our website at tabsanalytics.com for webinar invites as well as the exact times. Presenting today is Dr. Kurt Jetta, CEO and founder of Tabs Analytics. And at the end of this presentation, we'll open the floor to questions where you can submit via the chat box on the GoToWebinar screen. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jetta.
Thank you, Dustin, and thank you for those attending today's webinar. It's gratifying to see that the attendance and the sign-ups have gone up fairly significantly over the years, so it appears that the word is getting out, and just always hope to be providing relevant content. And if it's not content you're interested in, or there's any type of constructive criticism you have to offer, please do that at the end. There's going to be asking for some feedback. Today we're going to go back to the core essence of Tabs Analytics, when I started the company in 1998, being fact-based selling, and this process that I call FORCE, that I'll explain each element of that. But the context to where I provide this isn't so much similar to the world of 1998 when I started, where it was a fairly significantly growing industry, 4 or 5% a year consistently. A lot of growth in many areas, companies just getting on board with category management and fact-based selling. Now we have an industry over the last 6 years and is in historically low growth rates. And in fact, if you look to the left, you can see that the largest manufacturers, the Tier 1 and Tier 2, those doing $1 billion and plus, are lagging behind the industry and have been for the last 6 years, and they're the ones making a disproportionately heavy investment in fact-based selling, category management, shopper marketing, all of the various quantitative tools to be more effective at retail. So what's happening? Why is this underperformance occurring when they're investing in a discipline that historically has been having quite a bit of success? And a lot of it has to do with just a lack of focus on the fundamentals of how to use data to sell product, to sell performance, to sell results. And you can see that the top 3 tiers, quite a bit of a significant part of the industry, 65%, and that's where the lag has been. So what is FORCE? So it's 5 components. First of all, it's fact-based, it's objective, it's reliable, it's credible, and it's easy. It's easy to follow. And so we'll go through each component with some examples separately. Let's talk first about fact-based and what that entails. Category management is inherently data-oriented. Without data, you really don't have category management, because what we're trying to do is provide a fact-based rationale on why we would like retailers to accept our recommendations, either on pricing, distribution, or promotion. And we accept the premise, or else we get out of the industry or get out of our jobs, that facts trump judgment. With facts, what we can take away is a high percentage of the subjectivity that used to be so prevalent in buyers' decisions. They used to judge on features and benefits and aesthetic considerations. Well, that's all goes away if you can provide data that says consumers actually like this, these products actually sell better than the others, this performance of this promotional strategy outperforms other strategies that they've been doing and developing from the gut. So that's why facts matter and why we use fact-based selling to achieve much of what we're trying to do at retail. But the key thing to understand is there is way too much reliance on syndicated data. That's IRI, it's Nielsen, it's spins in the natural channel, it's NPD. I mean, that's of course always going to be the cornerstone of the way we do our jobs. It's the most complete data source and the most accurate and generally considered to be the standard of reality that we're judging retail performance. But make no mistake about it, there's storm clouds on the horizon with that data source specifically. Certainly most of you should be aware of the issues regarding Kroger data availability. If you're a Nielsen customer, you won't have access to that information, and the prices being charged by IRI are prohibitive in many cases now that they have an exclusive arrangement. And that's not isolated to just IRI doing that types of exclusivity. We see Nielsen doing it as well. Of course, Spins is exclusive in the natural channel, but they don't have the largest retailer, Whole Foods, which is working with Nielsen. So we have this patchwork of syndicated data that just almost by necessity requires that we find new data sources to do our jobs. And what are those sources? What facts are available? Well, of course, we have the syndicated data, and that should always, despite its problems, should still be the cornerstone. I mean, most industries would kill for that level of granularity and the ability to customize the data. We also have household panel data, Nielsen, IRI, and then a new service called InfoScout that has a lot of strengths and weaknesses that versus the traditional panel data resources, but it's something that definitely is in the consideration set now. We also have data coming right from the retailers, either their point of sale data or their shopper card data. And point of sale data, such as Retail Link and Partners Online, has been around for quite some time. But it's always stands to question, are we using it as best as we could? And then shopper card data, we just hear so many people still trying to figure out what do they do with this? How do they get some value out of it? We also have data sources of ad image data you can get from MarketTrack to not only understand, get an image and test compliance for performance, but also they capture a lot of data on the quality of the promotion. How is the promotion executed as far as consumer offers, price points, other ads, other products in the ad, etc. Similarly, there's media and couponing data from either Kantar or IRI. The big, most underutilized powerhouse data source that I'd like all of us to start thinking about is survey data. It's this powerhouse data source because it's cheap, it's fast, and it's statistically valid. It is the only thing that it lacks. Well, I mean, you can make a case, lots of, there's several shortcomings, but it doesn't have the granularity you get in syndicated data, but it does capture parts of the sales retail environment that syndicated is not capturing. For example, e-commerce or specialty channels or home shopping, those types of things. And then finally, we need to start looking at other sources, government and industry sources. E-commerce also has some tracking features. ComScore and Nielsen's coming up with a new service as well. So there's a lot of other data that we need to start putting into our basket to do our jobs and to deliver fact-based selling that will make us more successful. But there are certain what we call blocking and tackling facts. Anybody that purports to be a salesperson or a category management person for a consumer packaged goods company, if I'm a retailer, I'm thinking there's almost no excuse for you not to have this information. So here's what we call the blocking and tackling facts. These are gotta-haves. What's the size of the market that we can measure, both from syndicated sources but also an all-outlet view? So that data is available. It's through, and I'm going to show you some examples of how we get that using survey and augmenting survey with syndicated. What's my share? So that's kind of what everybody seems to know, and they pretty much shut it down after what's their share, maybe their sales trends. What's my sales productivity? That's the real measure of consumer preference. I don't care if you have a 20 share, particularly if you then tell me you have 30% of the items. I want to know what is that relationship to the sales you're delivering with respect to the number of items you have on the shelf within that category. What are the true growth trends? Okay, you've told me that you grow 10%, but is that all velocity-based or is it distribution-based? Is it a combination of the two? So you should know that. That is the most predictive measure of future sales, is factoring out distribution changes. What is my underlying trend? Here's another big one. What's my aided brand awareness and favorability? We see so many smaller companies that are just, are totally outraged that they don't get the proper credibility, or they're being replaced by private label, or any of those types of issues that they face at retail, but you haven't even invested enough money to understand what is the level of awareness of your brand. Do you even have a brand? And if you have a brand, is there any type of perception, favorability, other than neutral, like, I know it, I don't really know anything about it, I'm neither positive nor negative. If you have either low awareness or a high degree of neutrality of your brand, you really don't have a brand, and you really have a very weak case, or a much weaker case, to substantiate your continued presence at retail. And then finally, you get through panel data, but it's also available through survey. What's my penetration? What percent of the households out there are using me, and what's the level of loyalty? How loyal are my customers, and how much repeat do they do versus similar products in the category? Now we go to objectivity, and this is, I've always felt like something that just never really gets the importance. I mean, there's a lot of lip service, but particularly you see some of these large tier 1 companies, that's kind of, they're known for their total lack of objectivity, and they just so hurt themselves. And I hear it from retailers, I hear it from competitors, and I see it directly when, at times I've been on appointments, dual appointments with 2 companies presenting. And so the way to be objective is, first of all, preempt those potential objections by bringing up the negatives of your own business. Can't tell you how many times I've delivered a great presentation, all the facts, all the stories, but there are some negatives that needed to be addressed. They never get addressed. They're addressed at the end because God knows retailers have that data as well. They know how your products are performing, and the fact that they weren't addressed undermines the entire story. So that really is, once you do that, you're trying to build trust, and you build trust by being objective and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of your brands, and offering up areas of opportunity for the competitors that will help the retailer. If you believe in your brands and you can prove that they sell well, they are popular, they have a strong demand, you shouldn't fear what your competitors are doing. Or you shouldn't fear that there may be some negatives. Nobody is perfect at retail. Even the strongest brands always have 10 to 15% of their assortment that could get whacked tomorrow. So everybody can, would be well served to serve that up before the retailers have to come after you on their own. So you're serving up those weak items for deletions, and then you're also offering up what can replace it. Maybe it's some of your products, maybe it's some of your competitors, maybe it's just shrink the shelf in general. All you're doing is putting money in the credibility bank by being objective. And that in and of itself is probably, from my experience, over 30 years of doing category management, is the most effective tool in building trust and ultimately long-term effectiveness. Here's I'll go through an example. This is Kind snack bars back 2 years ago, or not 2 years ago, 2010, so we're talking quite a while. Very strong, #3 brand in the natural channel. You can see this productivity, basically saying sales per SKU in both dollars and units well above the category average. See those indices right there. The growth trends were very strong. Units up 64%, distribution up 16%, so we had velocity up 42%. I mean, this is in the natural channel, so you had these real strong, in fact, accelerating growth in the natural channel. Now, they were getting a lot of pushback from the natural guys because they were trying to make the move over into mass market right at the same time. Well, here's a one page that preempts all that. because you can say, look how well we're doing, and yes, we have, and here's now what's been happening to our brand in the food outlets. And it's not nearly as big or as strong at this point, so it still had just gotten fairly new in the mass market. See, number 11 brand, 2% share, low productivity. In fact, there were a couple major retailers who were ready to toss this brand in its entirety. So their average sales per SKU was 15% below the category on dollars, 38% on units. This is a sell sheet that was used. They said, we acknowledge we're not where we need to be, and on a unit basis, we're way below. So there's two things you do. First of all, is there something in the data that gives you hope? And that's what I'm about to show you. But you also have a plan to fix it. Well, then what we showed is that units were actually up 55%, dollars up 44%. So this was clearly a growing brand. Distribution was only up 28%. So by the total distribution points divided by 100 is what we call ACV weighted SKUs. So that velocity was still growing. That is very, very difficult for brands to achieve both significant growth on distribution and velocity. Normally what you see is if you get big gains in distribution, you start tending to dilute your line. But here this is clear evidence that they were building an audience in the food channel, while at the same time they weren't just shifting people from the natural channel. And you see these real strong growth rates depending on whatever period of time. This data combined with a plan then that they had where they were going to start sampling in the mass channel, but basically said, just stick with us. We have a plan, we're building an audience, and the rest is, is history, as they say. I mean, back now they're the number 2 brand in the market, very strong, high awareness, all the good things that they felt like they could be back in 2010, and fact-based selling was a big part of why they were able to hold on and get through the rough spots. Now let's talk about the R, which is reliability, and we define that by the ability of facts to withstand outside scrutiny. Now you have to understand, particularly as you're presenting to big retailers that have a category captain type of structure, anything you present goes right to them. The buyer a lot of times will just toss them the whole presentation, ask for any feedback. Usually the unobjective category captain just trashes it or picks up, undermines it with valid data. So you need to be able to withstand that scrutiny because it is not only scrutinized by retailers, but the category captains as well. And so when we say make sure the data is reliable, make sure, there's data that is just flat out wrong. We're always trying to avoid that. But there's some times where people think it's right, but they're using uncredible sources that lack credibility. Also, this is a big showstopper. There's so many times people will show category data or share data that doesn't align with how the buyer defines it. I've seen so many times, well, you're doing great in the category, you're up 10%, buyers saying like, no, I'm not, or I'm down 5. Or usually it's the opposite, the buyer's showing up 10 and you're saying, well, you're down a little bit, and it's because there's the way it's defined, you're defining the category. A lot of times these buyers are getting data that will totally eliminate discontinued items from their view. Maybe sometimes just the way you're defining what's in and out of the category, so you kind of get one rigid structure. You can look at the category that may or may not align with the way retailers, this particular variance is you see at retail on category definitions. Data that's misleading, so it's basically showing, the example I would use is, hey, I'm a 30 share brand and I'm doing great and I'm growing by 10%, but you didn't show them that it's 40%. You have 40% of the SKUs and you grew your SKU count last year by 30%. So that's clearly misleading. Or data that's thinly sourced. So make sure that people know where this data is coming from. Just throwing up a big market share or big growth or organics is growing 30%. Well, based on what? Who are you, quoting there as that, and to justify that? And then we're going to talk about, can you corroborate that with other data sources based on, one premise? Also, data that doesn't align with other sources. So you want to make sure that, again, that it's reliable, that I can look at several different data sources and come up with the same conclusion. So I'm going to show you an example. Well, let's talk about some of the examples of unreliable data first. What's unreliable? Well, 52-week data is unreliable. Why is that? Well, because things change so much in a period. You get new products, you get discontinued items, all kinds of things that could change or disrupt the trend. You want more recent period to understand what is the true underlying trend in this category. Market share, as I've cited many times, not reliable because it doesn't really measure preference or productivity. Syndicated panel trends. So what that means is the syndicated services, and they'll tell you this as well, you shouldn't use it to project kind of the standard panel service tracking year to year, because it's not a static or the same panel from year to year. You can't use that for trends. So you need to do a custom study that holds those panelists constant over a longer period of time. That in fact is reliable and actually a very strong, powerful data source. Percentage of sales on deal. What we're seeing is that the prevalence of digital coupons is really jacking those numbers up, but they really don't work that well. But it shows a lot more sales going out on deal, and you're not being as effective. So you need to always be wary of that. Or ACV with display. That has always been problematic, as any person in the field can tell you, because they're held to account for it. A lot of times bonused on these measure that has inherently high level of measurement error. So you can't really tell the difference between if it says 38% ACV and 50. I mean, that is within the range of error. What you can do is resegment the data or recode it to say high, medium, and low levels. So you're rescaling it. So you're not getting at the precise measure, but you want to know, is there a significantly high level of display? Syndicated baseline sales data. A lot of times you get for specific event analysis on an aggregated period. It is a bit more reliable because you're smoothing out all these phantom spikes that you tend to see on a week-by-week basis. And then also market estimates from a specific industry. I gave you the example of organics where they're always hyping the size of that. When you look at the actual data, organics is usually very weak. And then also now you look at the softness in whole foods. You look at that whole channel as well. If organics was that strong and growing as much as it said, they would still have, they'd still be showing some pretty significant growth, even as mass market retailers start bringing in their own products. So here's an example then of reliability or corroborating with other data sources. This is survey data. So we got the awareness of large toilet paper brands back in 2009. We're going to focus on White Cloud and Store Brand. You can see pretty low levels of favorability. Very low levels of conversion for White Cloud, which is the percent of people that say they bought it divided by those aware. This is of the total market, but in the major retailer that carried these two and really had made a major investment behind Store Brand, and they really expanded their assortment, you can see that they're even lower level of favorability, lower awareness, lower conversion. And so these are just horrible numbers, and then their control brand at very low conversion as well, slightly better than national, but barely. I mean, still not even anywhere near at competitive levels. And so this is just survey data, and it's easy to dismiss, oh yeah, measurement error, all that stuff. But then we looked at the actual scan data, and we saw that the development of private label toilet paper in this retailer was way below the all outlet, and so if we backed out this retailer from the all outlet, it'd be even a bigger gap. So that's where we're bringing in, so now the retailer has comfort that this survey data is accurate and valid, and they can draw even more inferences from some of these other brands. Here's another example I'm going to show you again where we talk about, and this will kind of drive home that whole productivity. So I'm looking at hair care based on the price range, so value brands, and this is not just isolated to hair care, but cosmetics and oral care and a lot of food products as well, where value brands are just really getting squeezed, and they want to either trade up the consumer or trade them down to private label. But there is a consistent or a significant market here, and so if I look at, so this is a segment, just 6% of the market in this particular retailer, but if I look at a more reliable measure and a valid measure of consumer preference, I see they have 6% of the dollars, 13% of the units, and only 8% of the SKUs. So if I take 6.5 divided by 8.4, that gives me the 77. So we know that a value brand is going to have below average dollars. But we also should expect, and in fact we see, that the productivity on a unit basis, the velocity, is much higher. And in fact, this velocity is so much stronger than the dollars is below average that we have a power index by multiplying those two that says this is a pretty strong segment that deserves more attention. Particularly for retailers that care about GMROI, and I know all retailers care about how much money they're investing in inventory, which GMROI is the way to measure that. Turns improves your better turns, improves your GMROI. So another way to make valid claims about segments. The share wasn't a reliable claim. The productivity is a more accurate measure of consumer preference. Now we get to credibility, and credibility is trust plus knowledge. Now somehow the Tier 1 and Tier 2 companies get a pass on both of those just because they're big. Right or wrong, understanding that they have an inherent level of credibility because their brands are highly valued to the retailer as well as to the consumer. So you're kind of, if you're a smaller company, that is a barrier overcoming. So you have to even go further to establish credibility, trust plus knowledge. Just because it's a credible source doesn't mean that the source is always reliable. We've talked about the Organic Products Trade Association, or a flashy headline from one of the major Wall Street Journal or Fox News or New York Times, but the data isn't reliable, doesn't stand up to outside scrutiny. It's just they decided to make a headline out of it. We establish our credibility by practicing the FORCE process, primarily the O, which is objectivity. So that is always something that we want to keep in mind. We're objective because we want to establish credibility, and when we have credibility, things become so much easier in the future to get our jobs done. And so we're going to talk about the easy part of keeping things simple and brief, but don't be afraid to stack your deck with lots of footnotes on where you got certain information and appendices. If they want to access more data and you want to prove you've done your homework on it, lots of appendices, and then it's up to them to decide if they want to go through the information. It's not for you to impose this 90-page monstrosity that they're going to have to go through. So then we get to the easy. So on the FORCE, the E is easy. And so first is the perspective of respecting your buyer's time. They have limited time. They have so many people that they're seeing during the day. Everybody is throwing all these monster decks and shares and carving up market share in any number of exotic ways. Usually none of it really kind of sets itself apart, and it's usually always too long. So respect your buyer's time. Our mantra is 5 pages or less, excluding the appendices, as I've mentioned. And it's really hard to be easy. It's hard to synthesize a compelling fact-based story into 5 pages. Any slug can just crank out 65 PowerPoint slides and throw a deck down with some cursory observations on each page, but it's very difficult, and it takes a lot of practice and expertise to come up with 5 pages that are going to make that point. So, and really, you want to leave them with a money chart. What are they going to take behind to show their bosses that what they're doing is the right thing? What is the most important page? Always develop your presentation with a money chart in mind. And also use easy-to-follow metrics. So take the time to explain new measures, and then also use caution for advanced statistics. You don't want to lay too much on these buyers. Remember, they don't have a whole lot of time, nor attention span, nor different levels of expertise. So you want to actually role play if you're going to lay a bunch of advanced statistics on them. Here now, I would show you the AQRF, and what's that AQRF, you might ask? Why, it would be the asymmetric quadratic response function, of course. So all this is a fancy way of talking about skew elasticity. How responsive are different categories to more or less space, and it follows this function called the AQRF. And so here's the logic of it, is that everybody's familiar with this diminishing response. That's the quadratic function. It actually peaks and then keeps coming down. Most curves you see kind of converge to the maximum. But actually it peaks, and so this is the quadratic. This is a response function, just showing how it's responding to changes in space, adding and deleting. And then the asymmetry basically means that I have a different response depending on whether I'm adding or subtracting. If I'm subtracting space, I tend to get rid of lousy items, and that proportionally has less impact than adding items that are probably good items I'm not carrying. But as I cut more and more, I'm cutting more muscle, and so I have this deceleration. Whereas if I add more and more, I'm kind of have that diminishing response. So that's the AQRF, and the reason why I talk about this is a fairly arguably a complex mathematical function. Hopefully you get the sense, though, that this is a fairly easy concept, an intuitive concept that people will understand, because then once I've set this up, now I then go into explaining why certain categories or segments are underspaced and how we would go about modeling that. It really follows this idea of the AQRF. And so that's kind of the caution I would use. I mean, you have to kind of understand what the buyer's threshold for kind of embracing or understanding this. You have to practice it out on others and then make it very brief. So an example of trying to make concepts easy. And now the big reveal, we're adding the D. I am pleased to announce that we have officially accepted D as differentiated into the force. So now it's force D, and that's really the big thing. We want to differentiate ourselves. I mean, any person in the industry is just going there showing syndicated data. But you want to augment that with other fact-based sources like I talked about, panel, shopper data, survey, ad tracking, and you want to show things that differentiate. I mean, anybody can just carve up share and percent change in opportunity gaps in any number of exotic ways, but you want to add different metrics. I already showed you things like productivity and organic growth and innovation indices, and you go back to some of the webinars I've done on new business metrics. I mean, you do it for two reasons. Use those metrics. One, it's more explanatory and more predictive, but two, it just differentiates yourself. Just stand aside from the pack. Just consider that the retailer on any given day when they're seeing vendors is talking to at least 10 and probably closer to 15 different vendors. What are you saying to them to differentiate yourself? And tell the retailers about their shopper, not your buyer. So how does your buyer compare to their shopper? That really gains traction. Are they aligned? Are they not aligned? I mean, how can my shopper, the profile of my buyer, help you in your store? So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of analytical differentiation. First of all, using outlet projections of survey, and then a new way to look at source of sales. So this is hair care, and we create a metric called share of category trips, which is a combination, a weighted model that we have that shows people that buy in a given outlet and then they state that they buy there regularly, and this gives us that visibility to an all-outlet view. How much is done at Amazon? How much is done at Ulta? And then we can look at, there's the vaunted millennials that we're just so hung up about, but isn't even our core audience. Most likely it's usually families with kids, and that mom is usually in the 35 to 54 range, but we'll continue in this obsession with the millennials. And to come up with actually a fairly interesting insight is that how big is e-commerce? Well, you can see it's about 5% of total. Amazon's more than half that, but only 2.9% among millennials, where everybody's saying everything's shifting to online because the millennials are driving it. Well, they're slightly higher, not that much. They're 3.7 and maybe 6%. So certainly there's a skew, and certainly over time it's going to get bigger, but it's clearly not the big behemoth that everybody's looking at. And if those of you that have heard my consumables webinar know that it really hasn't taken off at all for CPG, except in a few isolated categories. Here's another example of a fact-based selling story. Let me just also go, before I jump to that, the source of sales. I wanted to get a little insight into what's driving, say, the premium segment. So here we're going to look at what's called sales drivers. And so I'm going to look at, I want to know, is it distribution, is it velocity, is it promotion? So I'm just going to look at, here's my premium right here. If I just, so I've just highlighted these. So I'm looking at base versus incremental. Premiums up, a combination of pricing as well as unit sales. Base business is only up 1%. My SKU count, so it's really a distribution-based gain, but it didn't really help my base velocity because I just diluted the rest of my items at that retailer. If I go over, it's really promotionally related. My incremental's up 25%, and there's we decompose it into quantity versus quality of promotion. So here you see that the quantity actually came down. This number, that 2.55, tells me over a 24-week period I had the equivalent of 2.5 chain-wide events of brands within the segment. It's the quality, the average lift per event, that went up 64%. So that's a really big gain across a group of products. And so if we get into why are my sales up, that more than anything is the quality of the promotional events is what grew that business. So that kind of isolates on learning. I don't have to keep searching anymore. I've kind of isolated very quickly on what's driving that. And these analyses I'm showing you is for our QuickTabs 3.0, and that's actually something we're just launching now, and it has a lot of these additional metrics as far as source of sales. It also then can tell me new versus discontinued, so it has this item status that I think I've showed in a couple other webinars, where if I look at, say, my growth, I want to understand when I make changes, how did I do on my assortment decisions? Did the new items, which I can see right here, outperform the items that I discontinued? The answer is yes, and I brought in a whole lot more of them, so that was a pretty nice source of sales gain. But unfortunately, my base business was diluted a little bit, so the overall impact kind of it neutralized it. But at least on the assortment decisions, I knew I moved the needle a bit in the right direction. So I want to see what happened with my existing items. But that's also a new feature that we've built into this. So I want to finish it up with an example of a fact-based selling story that hits all of the points that I've just talked about, and it's about as mundane of a category as you could want. It's plastic cutlery, and our client's objective was to sell in a branded option in addition to private label, not to replace private label, because there was clearly a strong consumer demand for private label. So we start out with household panel data, and we compared retailers with dual distribution of branded and private label to without, and you can see the key metrics: conversion, average purchases per year, transaction size, all were better in the retailers which carried both. So is that enough to stand on its own? The answer is a resounding no. I need to know more before I kind of bring in a whole new brand. So the objection has always been, well, if this new brand's just going to take buyers from private label. Well, we looked at, okay, here's people that left the brand. The buyer flow analysis. Did private label benefit? No. Well, what about people that came to the brand? Did that hurt private label? Well, here's 7 million buyers. Fractionally it did. I mean, less than 1%, but basically no. Well, what about people that left private label? I bet they all went to Diamond, didn't they? Well, again, fractionally, maybe. 1.1 to 1.2, and you can see that's the big loss. I mean, mostly people are flowing out of the category, and then finally new buyers flowing to private label. I bet it came from Diamond. Nope, didn't come from them either. It was new buyers. So we're kind of, all this data lines up to there's kind of two distinct buyers, and when we fielded surveys, that in fact is what we found. They want two very different things. Private label wants price convenience. Diamond's more of a durability and quality play, and that's is what we got from just talking to people about, in surveys. Now you say, there's not a whole big sample, but it's these are such big gaps that does meet the statistical significance requirement of a real differentiation. And here's really kind of the, the slam dunk in here. So we looked at an actual retailer that did bring in a branded option. So here's private label in blue. We added the branded option there. It doubled their business. And you can see very little cannibalization of the private label. So that was all upside, all incremental. And why that's important is this is a very high margin business, even for the branded. So it's not so much the dollars that were great, but the margins even for branded were great. And so this was a win for this retailer and made a lot of sense. And so we finish it up and say, here's what we're asking. Most of your assortment should still remain in private label. That's the more popular and more, higher profit. But you really need an assortment of the leading branded items. So it's predominantly private label, augmented by branded, and that's the recommendation. 5 pages or less, differentiated, objective, because we're still saying private label carries the mail, reliable, because a lot of different data sources, credibility, because we've kind of adhered to all the other principles, and it's very fact-based oriented. So what is FORCE, besides this lame acronym, of course, but it's fact-based. It's objective, reliable, credible, easy, and of course the new kid on the block, differentiated. So that is our FORCE process. And as always, I thank you for attending, and now toss it back to Dustin for questions.